Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Timothy Johnson Medical Scholars Seminar Series. Before we get started, I just want to mention that we're now starting to accept nominations for speakers for next year's program. So please, everybody, take a moment, get together, talk it over, and send your nominations in. Either post them up on the website, or you can directly send them to Dr. LeConte, and the process of selection will begin very soon. And we very much value everybody's input for this very important program. So it is my great pleasure to introduce the program briefly. As everybody knows, this is the Timothy Johnson Medical Scholars Seminar Series, named in honor of Dr. Johnson, who was one of the founding faculty members of the Virginia Tech Ghrelin School of Medicine, and who was very instrumental in its earliest days in forming several programs, including this one, to bring in scholars who are practicing physicians and scientists and people that really blend the worlds of medicine and science together in a way to stimulate discussion, to build on the programs that are going on at the time in terms of the blocks in the medical curriculum, and in many ways to serve as role models that we hope many of you students in the studying for the medical profession, the medical degree, will aspire to, as well as to inspire our graduate students who work together very closely on translational areas of research. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Alex Di Felice Antonio, who is going to introduce Dr. Alain Dagher, today's speaker. So Alex, go ahead. I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Mike. I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Alain Dagher today as your medical scholar speaker. Dr. Dagher and I met, I think, years ago now through my postdoc mentor, Dr. Dana Small. He's really both an excellent and caring clinician, as well as a really insightful and pioneering researcher. Dr. Dagher started out at McGill in Montreal studying electrical engineering, and then went on to complete his MD at the University of Toronto. He focused on neurology at Cornell and then again at McGill, and has been a full professor at the Montreal Neurological Institute since 2013. Dr. Dagher just has so many publications in really all the kind of top neuroscience journals that are really well regarded and well cited, really too many for me to name here. He's maintained kind of a dual interest in studying both movement disorders as well as eating behavior and obesity, and has really been hugely influential in advancing our understanding of the neural correlates that underlie those processes and really where they share commonalities as well. Today, I'm really excited to hear about his new work focusing on the Omnivore's predicament, body weight and regulation, and cognitive control. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dagher.
Okay. So can you see my my slides?
Yep, looks fine. Great.
Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to try to tell a story about the neuroscience of body weight regulation, and maybe come up with an explanation for the obesity epidemic that we're experiencing for the last 50 years or so. So first, I would like to acknowledge the graduate students and scientists that I've worked with and that have helped me do the research that I'm going to present. In particular, much of the work I'll present is by these first three individuals, Uku Vainik, Celine Nesseliller, and Jung-Eun Han. And I'll cite them again as we get to their work. So the outline of the talk is that low cost of food is the driver of the current obesity epidemic. Body weight in humans is under the control of both executive function and prefrontal cortex, areas involved in decision making, and of homeostasis and gut peptides. I'm going to propose an economic thrifty hypothesis, which is that it's optimum to eat more when food is cheap and abundant, and that food abundance signals overeating by reducing self-control. So it's adaptive for humans and omnivores generally to overeat, to consume when the food is cheap and available. And the way this happens in the brain is in part due to reducing circuits involved in self-regulation. So normally I show this slide and I quiz the audience, but since we're on Zoom, I won't do that. But this shows the increase in obesity in blue. This is the US population percent obese, goes up to 2010. I think it would go up even higher now. And then in red is the total credit market debt as a percent of GDP. So since the 1960s, and especially since the 80s, the world economy has been driven by debt and, in other words, increased consumption. And one of the things that we're consuming more of is food. Now, of course, this is a little bit of a joke slide in the sense that we can't say for sure that these two things are correlated. But my argument is going to be that economics has a lot to teach us about the obesity epidemic. So this is another kind of a joke slide, but it's good fun to go to the Google Books Ngram viewer. It's basically a way to they've digitized every book published in English since, I think, the Middle Ages. But you can look for the incidence of any word that you want in the entire corpus of the English language, including books and newspapers. And you can see that the words restaurant and diabetes have increased together. Again, I'm not suggesting this is a scientific finding. It's also interesting to do the same thing for other diseases like tuberculosis and influenza. One interesting aspect of both of these is that they peaked. They have these two peaks here, which are related to the two world wars. And actually, when humans get together for war, they also infect each other. All right, so the title of my talk comes from this book by Michael Pollan, who got the phrase "the omnivore's dilemma" from Paul Rosen, a psychologist from Penn, who has studied eating behavior, the psychology of eating, for many years. And one of the things that is advantageous for omnivores is that you can derive nutrients from any environment. So when the food runs out where you are, you can emigrate and you can find food elsewhere. This allows you to live anywhere on the planet and avoid food shortages. However, it implies that you have to learn about food-nutrient relationships. You have to be able to adapt your behavior to the food environment rapidly. And the two most famous omnivores are the human and the rat, and they've both together populated the entire planet. So why do people say that economics has something to do with obesity? Well, so this is mostly the work of Adam Drunowski, who is at the University of Washington. He's shown that in the developed world, obesity correlates with socioeconomic status, meaning that people of lower socioeconomic status are more prone to overweight. He's also shown that unhealthy, energy-dense foods are cheaper than healthy foods, and they're cheaper on a per-calorie basis as well. Couple that with the fact that energy density predicts palatability, so foods that are more energy dense tend to be tastier. And you can understand why overconsumption of energy dense foods may occur. Another important argument is that food consumed during a meal is determined at the planning stages. So when you go to the supermarket and choose what foods you will eat, those are the foods that you will consume for the rest of the week. And he's shown that there's a strong correlation between energy content of the food purchased in the supermarket and daily caloric intake. He argues that 40% of the increase in weight in America can be attributed to reduced food prices. And there has been an extremely significant reduction in the price of food and the price of calories since the 1970s. Now, one counter argument to the idea that food availability or cost should drive eating is that we have a homeostatic system, right? We have a hypothalamus that regulates energy balance. However, food intake is probably not homeostatic. It's more likely to be explained by allostasis. And allostasis is this theory that was first proposed by Sterling and Ayer, which is that organisms don't just make decisions and behave according to exactly current needs, which is what homeostasis predicts, but they make predictions about the future. And in particular, that energy balance and food availability should drive food intake. So your current state of energy balance should make you more likely to consume foods, but food availability also should drive intake and predictions about future food availability. And this looks like a very economic diagram where needs and opportunities are balanced to lead to a decision, a purchasing decision. So we were influenced by this. And we adapted this paradigm that was first developed by Antonio Rangel from Caltech for fMRI. And it's an auction task where you show people images of foods and you have them bid for the right to purchase and consume the item. So you would show 50 different foods, familiar foods that people have consumed in the past. And you just ask them to bid between $0 and $5 for the right to purchase the item after the experiment. And this has been developed in economics, and it's been shown that this paradigm is a very good measure of current level of wanting. So what you can do is you can do this during functional magnetic resonance imaging, and you can show food pictures and have a measure of wanting or willingness to pay for each food image. So this is what we do. We show multiple images, one after the other, and we get the bid amounts, and then we relate brain activity to the amount that was bid. So we get a map, a brain map of wanting for each food item. For those who don't know, functional magnetic resonance imaging measures cerebral blood flow, which is related to brain activity. So essentially what we're measuring with fMRI is neuronal activity in each region of the brain. So the first thing you can see is that there are many brain areas that seem to modulate their activity based on the value of the food items. Some areas of interest are the midbrain, where dopamine neurons are present, and the nucleus accumbens, the ventral striatum, which is the major site of dopamine action in the limbic system. And also the orbitofrontal cortex here, an area that's known to be involved in value computations. Now, Rangel has shown that one area in particular is really important for value computation using the same task, and it's this ventromedial prefrontal area. So remember this area because it's going to come up again. But in this study, they show that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex appears to compute value of the items that are shown to people based on this auction task. So the VMPFC computes value, and that value signal is used to make a decision. So we applied this paradigm to 50 different familiar food items, as I showed you before: apples, carrots, potato chips, cookies, things like that. And there was an interesting finding in this study. The first is that the bid, or the willingness to pay, the wanting for these food items, was proportional to the true caloric density of the items. So food items that are more dense calorically were more likely to be wanted. However, another interesting finding was that after the study, we asked people to rank the items and to tell us how caloric they were. And what you can see is that estimated calories had no relationship to bid price. So the wanting was driven by the true caloric density, not by the estimated caloric density. So people were not very good at estimating the amount of calories in these familiar food items, but their motivational system was extremely good at estimating the amount of calories. So caloric density drove palatability, even in the absence of knowledge of estimated calories. And we found that this area, this ventromedial prefrontal cortex, tracked the caloric density of these familiar foods. In other words, when you were provided with the opportunity to bid for a food item, the more calorically dense it was, the higher the bid amount. So this suggests that wanting is driven by caloric density. Now, put that together with the fact that in the last 50 years, processed foods have been more and more calorically dense. And in particular, with the fact that the cost per calorie of food items is inversely related to energy density. In other words, the foods that are most energy dense are the cheapest in terms of calories per cost, or cost per calories. What this means, so if caloric density drives wanting and calorically dense foods are relatively inexpensive, when you decide about making purchases or when you choose which foods to consume, you will tend to overconsume foods that are energy dense because they're cheaper and more palatable. So this, I think, may explain these findings. So apologies for the font problem here, but ultra-processed foods are associated with increased cardiovascular mortality. The evidence is pretty clear. So this is a recent paper actually published this week from the Framingham study, Jewell et al., showing that people who consume greater proportion of ultra-processed foods have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular mortality. This is another study from a completely different country, from France, a very large study showing exactly the same thing. People who consume relatively more ultra-processed foods in their diet have an increased risk of heart disease and cerebrovascular disease. And presumably this is driven by obesity. I mean, not presumably, it is driven by obesity. So what it is that consuming ultra-processed foods leads to overconsumption of calories. Now, why is that? There's a whole bunch of theories. So here's another study. Again, apologies about the font, but ultra-processed food intake correlates with overweight and obesity. So you can see here in these forest plots. So the more you consume of these ultra-processed foods, the more overweight you are and the more heart disease you have. But why would this be? So there have been a lot of theories, and people are focusing, I think, on the wrong thing. People are focusing, for example, on the fact that maybe these foods are more convenient, maybe they have certain, there's even theories about certain compounds in processed foods that change your microbiome, which would promote obesity. But I don't think we have to look for a complicated answer, because ultra-processed foods are consumer goods and they're engineered for consumption. You can't engineer an apple or pasta or a chicken breast to be more calorically dense. It is what it is. But a prepared meal can be engineered infinitely to be consumed. And we've shown that foods that are more calorically dense are more wanted and therefore more likely to be purchased. So just by trial and error, food companies have realized that foods that are processed to be more calorically dense are more likely to be wanted, purchased, and eaten. So that's what ultra-processed foods, that's why ultra-processed foods lead to overconsumption, because they're engineered for overconsumption. You may have heard of this very famous recent study by Kevin Hall, which really supports this theory. So he had people on this inpatient unit at NIH where he can completely control food intake and energy expenditure of the subjects. And they were randomized to two diets, a 2-week diet of either ultra-processed food or unprocessed food. And you can look at the, you can look at the foods that are contained in these diets, and these ultra-processed foods are just more palatable and more desirable than these unprocessed foods. The other thing about the unprocessed foods is that they have to be made by a cook. They're complicated to make, whereas these ultra-processed foods, you just open up a package and heat it. But what he showed is that the energy intake was greater for the ultra-processed than the unprocessed foods. And these are the same individuals, 2 weeks apart. The other interesting thing is that the ultra-processed foods were consumed with greater vigor. They were consumed faster by the participants. In other words, these foods are more wanted, more desirable, and therefore people consume more of them. And not surprisingly, if you look at days on a diet versus body weight, you see this pretty clear increase in body weight under the ultra-processed diet and this reduction in body weight in the unprocessed diet. So there's a way to cure obesity, but as I mentioned, this unprocessed diet really requires you to have a personal chef or to be your own personal chef. So it is more complicated to follow. So in other words, this fits with the idea that the reason ultra-processed foods are associated with more weight gain is simply that they're more palatable and more desired. We have shown recently, not necessarily surprising, but this is a complicated structural equation model showing that adiposity is related to a brain atrophy and cognitive decline in older individuals. This is from the UK Biobank study, 20,000 people who had multiple measures of obesity-related factors and brain imaging and cognitive testing. These were done 11 years apart on average. And what this SEM shows is that adiposity and obesity leads to hypertension, diabetes, inflammation, and dyslipidemia, and that these factors lead to cerebrovascular disease as measured by white matter hyperintensities and cortical atrophy, which is related to reduced cognition. So this makes the case that adiposity via the metabolic syndrome leads to cerebrovascular disease and impaired cognitive function. And indeed, you may know that one of the main risk factors, besides family history, for Alzheimer's disease is obesity. Okay, so again, emphasizing this idea that the price of food and its caloric density will drive consumption is this interesting finding that foods demonstrate so-called price elasticity. So price elasticity is an economic term for the fact that when the price of an item goes up, consumption goes down and vice versa. And people have known about price elasticity, for example, for cigarette smoking. In fact, one of the main interventions that led to the reduction in the incidence of smoking was taxing tobacco. So even for drugs, even for people who are addicted to drugs, price has an influence on the decision to consume. And price elasticity has also been demonstrated for even staples like milk. However, it's not everybody who's sensitive to price. There's variation across individuals. In other words, not all individuals will change their food intake based on price or abundance. It varies across the population. One possibility is that those individuals who are very environment sensitive have this so-called thrifty phenotype. And the thrifty phenotype was a theory proposed in the 1950s to explain the rising incidence of diabetes already in the 50s, based on the idea that the thrifty phenotype was just this: when food is cheaper and more available, you overconsume. And the idea was that this was adaptive for our ancestors way back, before the invention of agriculture, that it was adaptive for them to overeat so that they would survive famines. Now, the thrifty phenotype has been falsified, or that particular version of it has been pretty much ruled out. However, there is this thrifty gene hypothesis that is making a comeback. And this is a very good review already from 2009 about all of the issues related to thrifty gene hypothesis. So the idea is that it is adaptive to maximize energy intake in order to offset the effect of fluctuations in food in the environment. Now, as I said, the original hypothesis from Neil was that the thrifty genes evolved, in the Paleolithic era, 100,000 plus years ago. And again, that theory has been falsified, but a new theory, let me just skip this slide. A new thrifty hypothesis has been proposed by Prentice and colleagues to have evolved during the invention of agriculture. So agriculture was invented by humans 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. And in agricultural societies, there is a fluctuation in food availability with the seasons. And their theory is that it is adaptive to overconsume after harvest time when the food is cheaper. In an agricultural society, you will have to pay for food. And when food is cheaper, if you overconsume, you will keep your body weight higher. And they've shown this in modern day Africa and Bangladesh. They've shown that actually body weight does fluctuate has seasonal fluctuation, and that this seasonal fluctuation is related to fertility. In other words, women, this is in Gambia, are more fertile when they have slightly higher adiposity. So a gene that promotes overconsumption when food is abundant would increase fertility and therefore be under very strong evolutionary pressure. So in the last few years, the genetics of obesity has become clearer. We know that body weight is extremely heritable. It's one of the most heritable traits. The heritability is 70%. But until recently, as is the case for many genetic or heritable conditions that are expressed through the brain, the genes were elusive. However, with the availability of very large data sets, we now realize that many of these traits are polygenic, meaning that they're the result of multiple alleles of small effect. So this is a study from 2015. It's now been expanded. The GWAS has been expanded. And I think this one had 340,000 individuals in it, but I think recent GWASs of obesity have as many as 1 million. And in this case, 97 risk alleles were found. These are SNPs. I think the number is up to over 100 now, but it's estimated that as many as 1,000 genes may be involved in body weight. So only 10% of the alleles have been discovered so far. So, and it's interesting because the number of risk alleles that you have is linearly related to BMI. So this is the BMI, and there's a linear relationship between the number of risk alleles and body mass index, much like is the case for height. The other interesting finding from this study is that the distribution of these risk alleles is Gaussian in the population. In other words, within the population, there are people who have alleles that make them at risk for overeating, and there are people who are resilient. And there's a theory that this is adaptive over populations. It's adaptive to have multiple strategies that would allow the population to survive big changes in the environment. And this study here demonstrates this is a way to measure the evolutionary pressure on different genes or alleles. And it's basically a measure for each SNP in the genome. You have a major and a minor allele, and the greater the ratio of major to minor allele, the greater the evolutionary pressure on that allele. And what you can see, so this is all of the, a measure of all of the SNPs and their evidence of evolutionary pressure. You can see that most of them have to do with body mass index, type 2 diabetes, BMI, body fat percentage. And the others almost all have to do with fertility, age at menopause, for example, and similar age at menarche. So genes that promote obesity or that promote overconsumption have been under strong adaptive pressure, which fits with this theory that with the development of agriculture, it became adaptive to overconsume when food was abundant. This is just showing that these alleles from that GWAS study of obesity are almost all expressed in the nervous system. So the reason your genome makes you prone to overeating is that it affects the brain. That's the organ that is important for obesity and overeating. Okay, so the story so far, there's a thrifty phenotype, which I would describe as overeating in response to signals of abundance or matching consumption to the environmental affordance. But what is that? What is this phenotype? How does it express itself in the brain? So my postdoc, Uku Veinik, who trained in personality psychology in Estonia, did this really nice review of the literature linking neurocognitive tests to body mass index. Each of these bars is a different kind of test. And the longer the bar, the more evidence there is in the literature for a relationship. And the color tells you the relationship between the test and body mass index. So green bars are mostly positive. That is, for example, most studies that have tried to link the Stroop, a measure of inhibitory control, to BMI, most studies show a positive effect, and there have been many studies. The other study that's very positive is the stop signal reaction time task, also a measure of motor inhibition. And in fact, what you can see is that most of the positive cognitive tests have to do with frontal lobe function, working memory, inhibition, executive function. Another area where there are many positive tests has to do with food motivation. So in terms of cognitive tests, it seems there's an interaction between systems involved in motivated behavior and systems involved in inhibitory control. You can also relate body mass index to personality, and many people have used the Big Five personality questionnaire to relate personality traits to BMI. And one fairly consistent finding, although not completely consistent, like much of personality research, is that people who score high on conscientiousness, that is good executive control, tend to have lower BMI. These individuals also tend to live longer and be healthier in other ways. And people who score high on neuroticism and extroversion, that is sensitivity to reward or to punishment, have higher BMI. So this could be the equivalent of the cognitive tasks where you have this interaction between self-control or inhibitory control and emotional reactivity. So this leads to a sort of a model of the trait that would lead someone to overeat. You have this interaction between sensitivity to reward and punishment and self-regulation. And the relation between the two we can characterize as uncontrolled eating. People who have high reward sensitivity and low self-regulation would suffer from uncontrolled eating and be prone to over-consuming foods and have overeating. And these can be measured. So these can be measured using questionnaires and laboratory tests, as I've shown. And they may have related brain endophenotypes or brain traits measured with structural or functional MRI. Both of these are also sensitive to stress, and stress resiliency may be another factor that relates uncontrolled eating to overeating. Okay, let's move on to the brain effects, the brain correlates of these phenomena. So this is a meta-analysis that we did on the self-regulation of appetite, and these are fMRI studies where people are asked to regulate their response to food cues. So essentially, people are shown pictures of tasty foods and told to either crave or regulate their reaction. That's the only thing that's the only manipulation in these studies, and we were able to find 21 fMRI studies. And what you can see is that during the regulate condition, there is activation of the prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex, a brain network implicated in self-control. This is often referred to as the frontoparietal control network. So when you ask people to regulate, they activate this control network. So we did this study to see if we could image the correlates of self-control in people who went on a diet. So we recruited people, otherwise healthy people who wanted to lose weight, and they underwent a pretty severe calorie restriction diet, 800 kilocalories per day, which is pretty low. And they did it for 3 months. And so we scanned them at baseline, at 1 month, and at 3 months. And we did our task where we show the food pictures and have them bid on the food pictures. We also, as a control, showed scenery pictures in this case. So, okay, not surprisingly, people did lose weight. So this is BMI, baseline month 1, month 3. There was also a change in gut peptides, again, not surprisingly. So baseline is in magenta here, and you can see that leptin, a hormone that is basically a measure of energy balance or energy stores. So leptin levels go down when you lose weight, not surprisingly. This is throughout the day. So this is when they come into the lab, and this is measured throughout the day. On the other hand, ghrelin, a hormone which triggers appetite, which increases food consumption and increases hunger, ghrelin goes up when you food restrict people. And this is one theory as to why it's difficult to stay on a diet. When you lose weight, your body, your homeostatic system notices this, and these two hormones, leptin and ghrelin, change their levels in such a way as to promote hunger and promote overeating. It has been shown that low leptin and high ghrelin both drive people to be hungry. And so this is what happens when your body notices that there's a negative energy balance. These hormones come into play and act on the brain and say, there's an emergency here, you need to eat. So one theory then is that this is why people have difficulty, or this is what determines success in weight loss. But we were interested in seeing if these self-control networks in the brain, in the prefrontal cortex, were implicated. So we have our fMRI study of that food wanting task. And here we're looking at which areas in the brain correlate with successful weight loss. And so here we have weight loss at 1 month. What you can see is that there's activation of this entire prefrontal control network. So that same network that was activated when people were asked to voluntarily regulate their food intake. Activity within this inhibitory control network predicts successful weight loss at 1 month and at 3 months. We then had the opportunity to call the people back 2 years later, so they were no longer on the diet, and we measured weight regain. And again, the activity of this prefrontal network at the initial start of the diet also predicted weight regain. So this suggests that this trait, this self-control trait, predicts how successful you will be at voluntary weight control. I don't know if I have all the figures, but we found that the ghrelin and leptin response was as expected, that ghrelin and leptin enhanced the response of the reward system to food items, but it was not a predictor of successful weight loss. It was the self-control system that predicted successful weight loss. And here we show the two areas that I've mentioned. So the ventromedial prefrontal area, which is involved in food regulation, in value computation that I've shown before, and the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in inhibitory control. You can see that as during the diet, the control area increases its activity in response to food cues, whereas the value computation area, which drives wanting, reduces its activity. And these two areas were actually functionally connected. When we did a functional connectivity analysis, we showed that these two areas are functionally connected and that the strength of that correlation predicted successful weight loss. So the conclusion of this study is that successful weight loss depends on an ability of prefrontal executive systems to downregulate the value response to food cues. So in the interest of time, I will skip this study. And I'll show just one last couple of studies. So I've shown that food wanting was driven by caloric density. We've shown also that executive control is important in determining the response to food in the present time, in the present instance, having an influence on decisions. But are there traits? Is it possible to measure an actual trait in individual, a phenotype that makes people vulnerable? And we've begun doing this with big data. So one thing that's revolutionized neuroscience, and especially the neuroscience of mental illness, is the availability of large data sets, open data sets with thousands and tens of thousands of people with brain imaging, genetics, and in fact, very high quality brain imaging. And the reason this has revolutionized the field is that we were relying in the past on very small sample sizes, underpowered studies that we know are prone to false positive and false negative error. So now we have access to these very large data sets. And this one in particular, the Human Connectome Project, is a project that was funded by NIH, where they collected on 1,200 individuals, very high quality brain imaging and behavioral measures. And in this study, Uku Vainik tried to correlate cortical measures, cortical thickness, gray matter thickness. So a measure of a trait, this is not functional activation anymore, it's cortical thickness. So something that's more or less fixed. And so he was able to find a map of brain areas that correlate with body mass index. The interesting finding, so here, blue means positive and red means negative correlation. So the first thing you'll notice, if you look at the frontal cortex is that there's this asymmetry. So left hemisphere increased cortical thickness and right hemisphere decreased cortical thickness appear to correlate with BMI. Now, this is a little bit surprising, but in fact, the theory that what drives behavioral impulsivity is an asymmetry between the left and right frontal lobes. That theory has been already proposed by many people based on lesion studies. And in particular, patients who have stroke of the right inferior frontal gyrus appear to have a tendency to gain weight after the stroke. This area, the right inferior frontal gyrus, has been shown by many studies to be important for inhibitory control. So while I said that the prefrontal cortex was involved in executive control, this right IFG region appears to be especially important for inhibitory control. And here we find that a thinner right inferior frontal gyrus is associated with BMI. We also, this human connectome data set also has personality measures and cognitive tests. What's interesting is we were surprised a bit by this, that we did not find any correlation between the big five, neuroticism, extroversion, conscientiousness, and BMI. So this is somewhat surprising, but this was what we found. The other thing that you can do with the Human Connectome Project is measure heritability. That's because they selected twins for this study and family members. So there's a large number of monozygotic and dizygotic twins and siblings. And so you can use family structure to measure heritability of any measure that you want. And here, for example, so the models that are used are these so-called ACE models, where you partition variance in your sample according to family, shared environment, and subject-specific environment. So you can use this to measure the heritability. Heritability means variance explained. So the higher the heritability, the higher the variance in the trait is related to family or to genetics. So in this study, we find that the heritability of BMI is around 75%, which is consistent with the literature. But then we also looked at the heritability of the traits, the cognitive traits and the brain-based traits that were associated with BMI. We find that they're also very heritable. So the cognitive phenotype that we found associated with BMI in this sample was also 75% heritable. And the brain structures, so cortical thickness of that frontal asymmetry that I showed, medial temporal lobe and subcortical structures, the brain signature of obesity was also extremely heritable. So this fits with this work by Speliotes on the fact that genes involved in BMI are expressed in the brain. Not only is BMI heritable, but the brain-based features related to BMI are very heritable. And here we just looked at the heritability of the correlation between cognition and brain and BMI, and we show here that it's close to 90% heritable. Okay, so let me just go to my conclusion slide for now. So what I've shown is that there's an endophenotype, that is a phenotypic trait that's heritable, that predicts or increases vulnerability to obesity. We call this uncontrolled eating. It relates to overeating in the presence of tasty, calorically dense foods. It can be identified by various measures and may be associated with low conscientiousness and poor self-regulation. So obesity in response to food abundance is ubiquitous. It affects 30 to 70% of humans. And there is this consistent neurocognitive endophenotype, as I said, in obesity of reduced executive control. I also showed you that better executive control was associated with successful weight loss during a diet. So this leads to a hypothesis, which is kind of a thrifty hypothesis, which is that there is a phenomenon of economic optimization where when food is cheap and abundant, you respond to this by overeating. And people who express this trait would have more offspring. They would be more fertile, and therefore the trait would be under strong adaptive signal. In other words, evolution would promote the development of this trait. So obesity alleles, I showed, are under very strong selective pressure. And the theory, which I think is not proven, but could be tested, is that people who score high on this thrifty phenotype have greater uncontrolled eating. And they especially have greater uncontrolled eating in response to food abundance. So the phenotype is when food is abundant, when calories are abundant, you overeat, and you overeat by relaxing the executive control system. I will end there. There is also evidence we can discuss in the question period. There is evidence from animal studies that exposure to food abundance does change these brain circuits to promote overeating. But I think the main conclusion of this work is that food intake is under the control of high-level decision-making systems, and that these systems have evolved to promote overeating in response to food abundance. And I think that this may explain a large part of the increase in obesity over the last few decades. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Alain. I wanted to read you some questions coming in from the audience. The first one is asking about social influence on consumption behavior. And they cite a recent Nature Neuroscience paper looking at midbrain dopamine response to food cues and social cues that were similar in different craving states. So fasting and then social isolation-induced craving.
Thank you. So I don't know this paper, but I will look for it. Obviously, in humans, food intake, like any behavior, is extremely complex and is very much determined by social features and by learning and personal experience. Almost everyone craves foods that they ate during childhood. So I think it's a difficult to study factor, but I think it's extremely important. Also, you referred to social isolation leading to social craving. I wonder if this is the paper. Is this the paper that used optogenetics to differentiate the two systems?
I'm actually not sure because I haven't read it either.
It may be, if it's from Deseroth's lab. There is a paper that showed that neurons in the orbitofrontal cortex, that it's not all neurons, that neurons are specific in terms of what kind of reward they respond to. Mm-hmm. So, and this is one important factor. When you're hungry, yes, you activate brain circuits involved in motivation to eat, but you have to activate only motivation to eat. You don't want to be motivated to do everything. So there has to be specificity for food.
Great, yeah. The next question was, and something actually that you kind of brought up, talking about kind of foods that you encountered during your childhood. Someone wanted to know, in assessing these participants with their different food choices, are you able to account for confounders such as learned preference, living in a food desert, memories associated with foods, or in kind of this bidding behavior, the difference between each person's kind of relative value of money itself.
Very good point. So yes, so in this study, we had people, before we did the imaging experiment, we had people rate the foods for familiarity. This experiment wouldn't have worked if the foods were completely novel. So these are all very familiar foods. Now, the other thing is, yes, that foods that we've experienced in the past are more likely to be craved, and they're more likely to have positive memories. But we can learn very quickly to like or crave new foods. You know, I had this experience. I went to Berlin once, and they have a specialty there. It's called a currywurst. It's basically a fried sausage with curry powder and ketchup, and it's not very good. It's really, actually, I don't understand why it became so famous, but I tried it, and I tried it a couple of times, and then I found myself craving it within one visit to Berlin. And of course, it's because it's very calorically dense. It's sugar, ketchup, and fat. But so you can learn, I think you can learn to crave and learn about calorically dense foods very rapidly with very few trials.
Great. I think Mike had a question or two, unless you would like me to continue with the ones in the chat, Mike.
I'll just be quick. I'm booking my ticket to Berlin. I got to get one of those sandwiches. A quick question about connectivity. You actually said something at the end about potential changes. So in the different areas of prefrontal cortex, when you looked at connectivity, for example, did you look at dynamics of that and do any kind of dynamic causal modeling to see, you know, what area was the driver, and is it longitudinally stable in an individual?
So we just used the two areas that came out in the main analysis. So we had an area that showed greater activation that predicted weight loss in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and we just did connectivity from that region to the rest of the brain during the food pictures. That's how we did the functional connectivity task. It would be interesting to look at dynamic functional connectivity, because if you think of self-control, it's something that you have to apply constantly, you know, every working hour, and you only have to fail once to fail. So this is something that I've never studied, but I'm sure one major aspect of self-regulation is the ability to sustain it over long, prolonged periods of time.
Okay, great. Thank you. Go on, Alex. Go on to the next question. Thanks.
Yeah, so the next one was interested in political, economic, or psychological factors do you most attribute to the lag in translational scientific research, to the lag in the translational scientific research community in addressing the neurological determinants of obesogenic eating patterns in light of the long-known lack of empirical effectiveness of willpower-based eat less, exercise more mantras?
Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure I didn't get the first part of the question. Oh,
he was asking, I read it poorly, if there were political, economic, or psychological factors that have led to this lag in being able to kind of translate your findings kind of more to the implementation side, I think is.
All right, I see. Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, that's a very good point. You know, there's a new treatment for obesity that's come on the market. It's GLP-1 agonists. They're extremely effective, and they were developed without any influence of the research that I've just mentioned. They were developed entirely based on observation in people with diabetes. So it is true, and this is true of psychiatry and psychology generally, that as interesting as the research is, applying it therapeutically is very difficult. There are people who use cognitive behavioral therapy in obesity, and there are claims that it is effective, but again, it has to be lifelong, and it's difficult to maintain. It's probably very difficult to maintain strong self-control forever, because that's what you need to do.
That's true. And I think this comes into, there's a question about if there you have a working hypothesis for basically how lean individuals avoid becoming overweight and obese in this environment of low cost, ultra processed foods.
They're lucky, I guess. Yeah. I mean, so as I mentioned, this variation across individuals is, you remember that BMI versus genotype graph, there's a wide variation in a population in this trait. And the reason there's a wide variation most likely is that it's adaptive for a population to have multiple strategies. They call this actually the portfolio effect. The idea that when you have a stock portfolio, you want many different stocks. For the same reason, evolution has found a way to have us all have different personalities so that the optimum strategy is present in the community. But so most likely this has something to do with it. And I think, although I've talked about the brain, I don't think it's the whole story. I think metabolic systems having to do with insulin regulation, liver and gut function are extremely important in weight control. And this is not something that I've studied, but it's probably not all about self-regulation.
All right, so we're just after 2. Do we want to cut it off here, or have one more question?
We've got some more time here, Alex.
Okay. So someone asked at the very beginning of your talk on executive function, you characterize a self-control phenotype related to eating and overeating. Do you know if there's a correlation between neurodivergent phenotypes characterized by poor executive function and a tendency for overeating and obesity?
There is. I didn't mention this, but one of the major relationships with obesity is ADHD. So ADHD is associated with weight gain. And if you look at overweight adults and measure and do cognitive tests or questionnaires related to ADHD, they score higher based on BMI. So, and that fits with the theory of executive dysfunction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's and so another question is someone asking do you think your research could inform any food system reforms in the US? And if so, how do you think? Oh, the class goes to 2. Sorry, the class goes to 2:15. So as far, do you think, how would you hope that would be used to kind of implement some reform in the US, or I guess, or in Canada?
Oh, everywhere. Yeah. Well, so we know, there's a good parallel with smoking. Probably one of the greatest public health advances, of all time has been the reduction in smoking incidence. And this was driven by the neuroscience in part. It was also driven by the finding that secondhand smoke causes cancer, but really governments acted when it was proven that nicotine was addictive. And I think similarly, evidence that engineered calorically dense foods promote overeating and promote obesity, that evidence should drive politicians to change the food environment. Some of the reasons that this is not my area of expertise, but some of the reasons that high calories are cheap is subsidies that are given to agriculture. Now, there are other, you could also tax, everybody knows that you could tax high calorie foods. The problem with food that's different than cigarettes, of course, is that if you raise the price of food, you run the risk of going to the other side, which is malnutrition. And it could happen very quickly. In fact, in developing countries, you can see malnutrition and obesity increasing at the same time. So it's probably more tricky than cigarettes. But I think one way that this research can influence policy is just by showing scientifically the factors that cause the food environment to be obesogenic.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a really important point to figure out how do we implement these things without especially harming communities that have low food access. The next question was about the cell metabolism paper. I actually have one to tack onto that too. And so they're asking, because they're kind of self-reporting their food liking, how do you think the fact that these participants were recruited because they wanted to join a weight loss trial, how that might have influenced some of their ratings or some of their responding?
Oh, that's a good question. Obviously, this is one of the problems with studying food intake and food control, that once you start asking about it, you change the behavior, and that the behavior is going to be affected by the people who join the study. I think that's unavoidable. I don't think that would have affected, say, the brain imaging findings. It might be that people who are better at losing weight would have performed the task better for reasons that have nothing to do with each other. But yeah, we can't rule that out. It's an interesting point.
I was interested in that also, in this kind of like robust activation that you saw in cognitive control networks, if that possibly some of that was due to these people kind of entering a voluntary weight loss program, that they had already exhibited some amount of cognitive control in joining this program, and that if, potentially from a sample that was, we love to just grab people off the street, but with actual random sample, you might see some more kind of heterogeneity in that response. Sure. And there might be those kind of different phenotypes that you've described in some of your other genetic work.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. But of course, these were all individuals who signed up for this study. And what we're showing is variability across that population. But it's true, that population is not representative of the entire population. No way.
Yeah. All right. I think there was one more question here. And it's a bit back to the implementation question about how your work could be applied to help people with obesity, to help people lose weight, and if kind of their quality of life is taken into account. That's the question.
Sorry, I didn't get the question complete.
How do you think this work could be applied to help people with obesity, and how has their quality of life been taken into account in your studies?
Yeah, most of our studies are about how the brain regulates food intake. We did one study on weight loss, and we are actually also studying people who undergo bariatric surgery. But I don't treat people with obesity. My clinical practice is in something completely different. But it's an important question, and it comes up a lot. There's this may not be answering the question directly, but there are people who don't like when you mention that food intake is under cognitive control. In fact, really good scientists like Giles Yeo and Stephen O'Reilly from Cambridge emphasize repeatedly, that if you talk about cognitive control and body weight, you're going to shame people. You're implying that it's your fault. And they often say that nobody chooses to be sick. But I don't think, I think those two things are in a way orthogonal. There's, how you talk to people and how you treat people is one thing, and understanding how brain circuitry leads to behavior is a different thing entirely. And I think it's important to understand the latter. I think it's interesting, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be relevant.
Thank you. Are there any more questions that people have? If you could put them in the chat. If not, I'll give it a little bit, and it might be time to wrap up. Or Mike might have an additional question. We'll see.
Oh, no, that's okay. No, I just want to thank Dr. Dagher again. That fantastic presentation. Thank you very much for your time. And
thank you.
Thank you so much.
That was terrific. Thank you, Alain. Really fascinating. If I could just ask you quickly offline here, amongst the alleles, the risk alleles, the 97 or 100, whatever it was, are there any certain pairs together that present a particularly greater effect? Can you extract that out of it?
The biggest effect is from a gene called FTO, and it still accounts for, I think, it counts for grams of body weight, not even kilograms. But I don't think we know how. I mean, there are theories, but we don't even know how FTO causes increased food intake. The second gene is MC4R, and that one we know, that's a hypothalamic gene that we know is involved in circuitry that regulates satiety. But and most of the alleles are unknown. People don't know how they work or how they affect the brain.
Dana were here, she would have to ask you about TAC or ANKK1. But
That doesn't come out in the GWAS, actually.
no, it doesn't.
The dopamine, it's interesting, none of the dopamine genes come out in the GWAS.
So doesn't FTO have some effect on dopamine neuron function?
Yeah, so that's right. It does. But it's not even clear if it's FTO or if it's a linkage disequilibrium with something that's related to dopamine signaling.
Anything related to serotonin receptors, downstream signaling pop out in there?
I don't believe in the GWAS, though of course we know that serotonin signaling is very important for weight regulation. One of the drugs that was effective in the past was serotonergic drug, which had to be taken off the market. And we also know that the SSRIs all cause weight gain, but no, it didn't come out. Obviously, for a SNP to come out, it has to be, it has to occur in at least 5% of the population. So yeah, leptin isn't in it, even though leptin is a cause of monogenic obesity. So.
Oh, fascinating. Well, thank you again, Dr. Dagher. Really terrific. Yep. Enjoy the rest of your visit.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you so much. It was great talk.
Great.